For 37 years, I preserved and maintained our historic family estate with my own hands, until my son's wife decided I was too old-fashioned for their vow renewal ceremony, and uninvited me just 3 weeks before the event. But the day they arrived to ask about borrowing the antique silver collection for their modern celebration, their rehearsed speech died in their throats. They had no idea that while I was tending my award-winning gardens and volunteering at the Historical Society, I had also become a certified appraiser with enough documentation to prove that the family heirlooms they coveted actually belonged solely to me, and that I had already made arrangements to have them professionally restored for a completely different purpose. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 73, I had envisioned peaceful mornings in my garden, afternoons giving historical tours of our community's landmark properties, and evenings hosting family gatherings in the home that had sheltered 5 generations of our family. Instead, I found myself at the center of a family conflict that tested not only my resilience, but my understanding of the true meaning of legacy and who has the right to control it. My name is Eleanor Harrington. My late husband Richard and I purchased his grandparents' deteriorating Victorian estate in the small town of Millfield in 1985, when we were empty nesters looking for a meaningful project to fill our next chapter. Willow Creek Estate was a magnificent but neglected property then, with peeling paint and a once formal garden reclaimed by wilderness, but it carried the weight of family history. Richard's grandparents had built it during Millfield's prosperous mill era, and it had passed through the family until Richard's cousin, facing financial difficulties, reluctantly put it up for sale. "This place deserves to stay in the family," Richard said the day we decided to purchase it, running his hands along the ornate but worn banister of the grand staircase. "It just needs some love and patience." I remember that day as if it were yesterday. The way the afternoon light filtered through the dusty stained glass windows in the foyer, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the faded wallpaper. Richard, always so practical during his 30 years as an engineering executive, stood transfixed by the craftsmanship that had survived decades of neglect. It was the first time I'd seen him truly passionate about preserving something from his family's past. "Can we really do this?" I'd asked, equally enchanted but mindful of the enormous undertaking. At 58 and 59, most of our friends were downsizing, simplifying their lives as retirement approached. "Together, Eleanor," he'd replied, taking my hand as we stood in what would become our favorite spot, the grand bay window overlooking the overgrown rose garden. "Think of it not as a burden, but as an adventure. Our next great chapter. Love and patience we had in abundance, even when money was tight. That first summer, we scraped together enough to repair the leaking roof and shore up the sagging front porch, with Richard doing much of the work himself, despite his corporate executive background. I learned to strip and refinish woodwork, restoring the library's built-in bookcases to their original mahogany splendor. We spent countless evenings researching authentic Victorian landscaping and began the painstaking process of reclaiming the formal gardens from decades of neglect, uncovering stone pathways buried under inches of soil, pruning overgrown heritage, roses that had survived against all odds, and reconstructing the central fountain from historical photographs we found in the county archives. Those early days were exhausting, but exhilarating. We would collapse into bed each night, our muscles aching, clothes stained with paint or dirt, comparing the small victories of the day. A section of original parquet floor revealed beneath linoleum, a forgotten rose bush coaxed back to blooming, a corroded light fixture restored to its former brilliance. "We're not just renovating a house," Richard would say as we reviewed our progress. "We're peeling back layers of time, rediscovering what was always meant to be here." Our children had mixed reactions to our ambitious project. Catherine, our practical daughter who had inherited her father's methodical nature, expressed concern about the scope of the undertaking, but eventually became our most dedicated helper, spending her vacation time learning restoration techniques alongside us. James, our more status-conscious son who was building his career in finance, initially saw little value in what he called our museum project, but changed his tune when his colleagues expressed admiration for his family estate. Over the years, with Richard's newfound carpentry skills and my growing expertise in historical preservation, we transformed that struggling property into a neighborhood landmark. We meticulously restored each room according to historical records, tracked down period-appropriate fixtures at estate sales across 3 states, and eventually registered the property with the National Register of Historic Places, a designation that Richard, with tears in his eyes, called validation that some things deserve to be preserved, not just replaced. The gardens became my special passion, evolving into a showcase of Victorian landscape design that would eventually win Millfield's Historical Garden Preservation Award for 11 consecutive years. I spent thousands of hours researching period-appropriate plants, consulting with horticultural historians, and gradually recreating the original designer's vision while adapting it to modern environmental considerations. The Rose Garden, with its collection of heritage varieties dating back to the 1850s, became particularly renowned, attracting visitors from across the state during our twice-yearly garden tours. A house becomes part of your identity through thousands of small decisions, Richard used to say, as we deliberated over paint colors, hardware finishes, or plant selections. Each one a testament to what you value, what you're willing to work for. What we valued was preserving the past while making it vibrant and relevant for future generations. The dining room where family gathered for holiday meals served by our own children and later grandchildren. The garden where we hosted the town's historical society fundraiser each summer. The carefully restored library where our book club met, monthly for discussions that bridged the gap between classic literature and contemporary issues. Most precious to me was the collection of family silver that had been stored in tarnished neglect in the attic when we purchased the property. We discovered it quite by accident during our second winter, when Richard was installing additional insulation. Behind a false wall in the attic, he found 3 sturdy wooden chests, each lined with faded velvet and filled with silver pieces, in varying states of tarnish and neglect. Over 200 pieces, from delicate teaspoons with hand-engraved monograms to elaborate serving platters with intricate garland designs, each bearing the family crest and dating back to the 1880s. There were specialized utensils whose purposes had been lost to time: asparagus servers, marrow scoops, berry spoons, and delicate grape scissors, each representing the formality and specificity of Victorian dining customs. Richard and I spent countless winter evenings researching each piece, documenting its provenance, and carefully polishing away decades of tarnish to reveal exquisite craftsmanship beneath. I can still picture him at the kitchen table, magnifying glass in hand, examining the hallmarks to determine the exact year and maker of each piece, cross-referencing with the family records we'd obtained from distant relatives. These pieces tell our family's story, Richard would say as we worked side by side, the scent of silver polish filling the air. Each scratch and dent represents a Christmas dinner, a birthday celebration, a moment when the family gathered together. We're not just cleaning silver, we're preserving memories. The silver collection became a symbol of our larger mission, rescuing beautiful things from neglect, honoring their history, and giving them new life and purpose. I became particularly skilled at silver restoration, eventually taking specialized courses in metalwork conservation to ensure I was using the most appropriate techniques. Richard built a custom cabinet in the dining room to display selected pieces, with specially designed lighting that highlighted the craftsmanship without causing damage from heat or excessive light exposure. As the years passed, our restoration of Willow Creek evolved from a challenging project to a fulfilling lifestyle. Richard retired fully from engineering consulting at 65, devoting himself to the ongoing preservation and improvement of the estate. I balanced my part-time work as a librarian with increasingly involved volunteer roles in Millfield's historical preservation community. Together, we established a small foundation dedicated to helping other owners of historic properties access resources and expertise for authentic restoration. Our social life centered around the home we had brought back to life. We hosted garden parties where guests were encouraged to wear period-appropriate attire, Victorian-themed Christmas gatherings complete with traditional decorations and carols around the restored Steinway piano in the parlor, and intimate dinners, where the silver service was used and appreciated rather than simply displayed. "This is what these beautiful objects were made for," Richard would tell our impressed dinner guests as they admired the gleaming silver candelabras or the ornate soup tureen. "Not to sit behind glass, but to be part of living traditions, to connect us to those who came before while creating new memories." Richard passed away 7 years ago, a lingering battle with cancer that he faced with the same quiet determination he had brought to every restoration project. In his final months, as his strength waned, he would still insist on being wheeled through the gardens or propped up in his favorite chair in the library, drawing comfort from the beauty we had reclaimed together. I still remember the final gathering, in our home before his passing, how the family filled the rooms he had so lovingly restored, how grandchildren ran up and down the grand staircase whose banister he had painstakingly stripped and refinished by hand, how the silver service we had brought back to life gleamed in the dining room as it served its purpose once more, bringing family together in celebration of a life well lived. "Promise me you'll keep it all alive," he whispered to me the night before he died, his hand clasping mine with surprising strength. "Not just the house and gardens, but the spirit of the place, the idea that beautiful things deserve care, that history matters, that family connections are worth preserving. I promise," I'd told him, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. After Richard died, many people assumed I would sell the estate and move into something smaller, perhaps one of those modern senior apartments near the community center with their granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, a sterile vision of convenience that held no appeal for me. "It's too much house for one person," they would say, not understanding that these walls contained more than memories. They held my purpose, my connection to Richard, and the fulfillment of our shared vision for preserving family heritage. "Have you thought about what's next?" well-meaning friends would ask, their tone suggesting that widowhood at 66 necessarily meant downsizing, retreating, diminishing. "This is what's next," I would answer, gesturing to the home around me. "Richard may be gone, but our life's work is still here, and so am I." Instead of selling, I threw myself into maintaining and even enhancing our vision. I completed the restoration of the carriage house that Richard and I had begun planning before his illness, transforming it into a small museum space where groups could learn about Victorian daily life through hands-on experiences with period tools and household items. I expanded the historical garden tours to include educational programs where children could learn about heirloom plants and sustainable gardening practices that had been common in the 19th century. I became even more involved with the Millfield Historical Preservation Committee, helping other homeowners navigate the challenges of authentic restoration while accommodating modern needs. What few people realized was that my dedication to maintaining Willow Creek Estate went beyond emotional attachment. It was also practical. The property had been carefully structured before Richard's death to minimize inheritance taxes and maintenance costs. We had established an endowment fund that covered major repairs and improvements, ensuring the estate wouldn't become a financial burden regardless of what happened to property values or my personal finances. The historical designation provided property tax benefits, and the occasional private events and garden tours I hosted generated enough income to supplement my pension and cover ongoing expenses. We had installed geothermal heating and cooling systems and other energy-efficient updates that were invisibly integrated into the historical structure, dramatically reducing utility costs despite the home's size. financially and emotionally. Staying put made perfect sense. It also allowed me to remain at the heart of the family we had raised. Our daughter Catherine lived just 30 minutes away in the neighboring town of Riverview and visited weekly with her children, often spending Sunday afternoons helping me with seasonal garden tasks or assisting with preservation projects. Her teenage daughters, Emily and Sophie, had developed a genuine appreciation for their heritage, with Emily showing particular interest in historical fashion and Sophie becoming surprisingly skilled at identifying period furniture styles. Our son James lived farther away in the city, but brought his family for major holidays and summer visits. His relationship with Willow Creek was more complicated. He appreciated its impressiveness and the status it conferred, but seemed less connected to the preservation values that animated Catherine and me. Still, his children loved exploring the grounds and had shown genuine interest in family stories, particularly those connected to specific rooms or objects throughout the house. "You've created something special here, Mom," Catherine often told me during our quiet moments together. "This isn't just a beautiful old house. It's the center that holds us all together, the one constant in everyone's changing lives." The estate had indeed become the family gathering place, the setting for Christmas mornings and Easter egg hunts, summer barbecues and Thanksgiving dinners. I took particular joy in watching my grandchildren develop their own traditions and favorite spots, reading nooks in the library, hiding places in the garden, windows where they liked to watch thunderstorms roll across the valley. James seemed to value the estate as well, though in a somewhat different way. While Catherine appreciated the historical significance and the preservation work itself, James focused more on the estate's prestige and its role as a setting for important family occasions. His career in corporate finance had made him status-conscious, something that had only intensified after his marriage to Melissa 5 years ago. He had met her at a charity gala in the city, a sleek fundraising event for urban renewal that bore little resemblance to the community-oriented historical society functions I frequented. Melissa was 15 years younger than James, a former marketing executive who had transitioned to what she called social entrepreneurship, which seemed to involve organizing exclusive events for wealthy donors to various causes. Melissa came from what she called new money, a wealthy family whose fortune had been made in tech development rather than the manufacturing and agriculture that had built Millfield's older families. From the beginning, her relationship with Willow Creek Estate was complicated. She admired its grandeur and photogenic qualities, often using it as a backdrop for professional family portraits and social media posts, but seemed to view its historical authenticity as something of an inconvenience. I remember her first visit to Willow Creek vividly. She had arrived wearing stiletto heels that clicked alarmingly against the original hardwood floors and seemed genuinely confused by the absence of central air conditioning in the older wings of the house. When James proudly showed her the library, with its floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with first editions and family volumes, she had smiled politely and asked if we had considered opening up the space by removing some of the heavy wood elements. "Have you ever considered updating the kitchen to something more modern?" she asked during one of their early visits after marrying James. "These vintage appliances have charm, but a restaurant-grade range would make entertaining so much easier." "The kitchen has been restored to its 1910 renovation," I explained, perhaps a bit too didactically. "It's one of the features highlighted on the historical registry. But we've incorporated modern elements discreetly. The refrigerator panels match the original cabinetry, and the dishwasher is hidden behind a period-appropriate facade. It just seems like a lot of effort to preserve something so outdated," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. These small friction points multiplied over time. Melissa's vision for family gatherings involved caterers, elaborate decorations ordered from high-end suppliers, and precisely orchestrated photo opportunities. Mine emphasized authenticity, personal touches, and the kind of relaxed togetherness that had characterized our family events for decades. When she suggested replacing the handmade Christmas ornaments that had adorned our tree for generations with a professionally designed color scheme, I drew a gentle but firm line. Some traditions weren't open to modernization. Mother Harrington, I understand your attachment to the past, she said, using the formal title she had adopted rather than my given name. But surely you can see how these homemade decorations lack sophistication. James's position at the firm means we need to consider the impression we make on colleagues who might visit. The impression I hope we make, I replied carefully, is of a family with history, with authentic connections to each other and to those who came before us. That's what these ornaments represent. Your children's grandparents, their great-grandparents, all contributing to a living tradition. She had conceded that particular battle, though not without suggesting we might use the family ornaments on a secondary tree in a less visible location. I declined the compromise, and the Christmas tree remained as it had always been, a joyful, somewhat mismatched collection of family history in ornament form. When James and Melissa announced they would be celebrating their 5th anniversary with a formal vow renewal ceremony, I was genuinely happy for them. Their marriage hadn't been without challenges. James's demanding career and Melissa's equally ambitious social aspirations sometimes created tension, but they seemed committed to marking this milestone in a meaningful way. We'd like to host. It here, Mother Harrington, Melissa said during a Sunday phone call 3 months before the planned June event. Willow Creek would be the perfect backdrop for the theme we're planning. Of course, I agreed, pleased that they valued the estate. For this important occasion, the garden will be at its peak in June. The roses along the South Terrace would make a beautiful ceremony location. Actually, we're thinking of a more modern interpretation of tradition, she explained, a note of rehearsed diplomacy in her voice. We'd like to use the garden but bring in contemporary elements, a minimalist color scheme, architectural floral arrangements, that sort of thing. James says you're usually quite traditional about how things are done at Willow Creek, but we're hoping you'll be flexible for our special day. It's your celebration, I assured her, though I wasn't entirely sure what architectural floral arrangements might entail for my carefully maintained historical garden. I'm happy to accommodate your vision. What followed were weeks of increasingly detailed requests and requirements. Melissa hired an event planner named Simone with a specialty in modern heritage events, whatever that meant. They visited multiple times, measuring spaces, discussing rental equipment, and mapping out a transformation of the property that seemed to grow more elaborate with each conversation. We'll need to temporarily remove some of the garden statuary, Simone explained during one walkthrough, her tablet in hand as she made notes. The classical elements clash with our contemporary aesthetic, and we're thinking of draping the pergola in sheer white fabric, Melissa added, gesturing expansively at the wisteria-covered structure Richard and I had rebuilt by hand 15 years earlier. It will soften the heaviness of all the wood and create a more ethereal atmosphere. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that this was their celebration, not mine. The statues could be carefully stored and returned afterward. The pergola would survive whatever temporary decorations they attached to it. The garden would recover from whatever modern interventions they implemented. It was the silver collection that became the unexpected flashpoint. 3 weeks before the ceremony, during what had become almost daily planning visits, Melissa mentioned, casually, that they would definitely be using the family silver for the reception dinner. The full service for 36? I asked, surprised. That would be wonderful, but it requires very specific handling and care. Some pieces are quite fragile after nearly 140 years. Don't worry, she replied dismissively, barely looking up from the seating chart she was reviewing with Simone. Our caterer handles valuable items all the time. They'll take full responsibility. Something in her tone, the assumption of authority over items that held such personal meaning for me, that represented hundreds of hours of painstaking restoration, with Richard, triggered an uncharacteristic protectiveness. I'd be more comfortable overseeing the silver myself, I said carefully. Perhaps we could work with the caterer on a compromise that protects the collection while meeting your needs. Melissa exchanged a quick glance with Simone before setting down her pen with deliberate calm. Mother Harrington, this is going to be an extremely sophisticated event with very important guests from James's firm. We can't have, well, amateur involvement in the service elements. It would reflect poorly. The implications stung that my decades of careful stewardship constituted amateur involvement, that I might somehow embarrass them in front of important guests. Before I could formulate a measured response, she continued with what was clearly a prepared transition. Actually, that brings up something James and I have been meaning to discuss with you. Her voice adopted the carefully modulated tone people often use when delivering prepared bad news. We've been revising our guest list and event flow, and we're concerned that the celebration might be overwhelming for someone your age. The ceremony will run quite late, with dancing and socializing until the early hours. We think it would be better if you participated in just the daytime elements. I blinked, trying to process what she was suggesting. You mean leave before the reception dinner? But I live here. This is my home. Of course you'd retire to your suite for the evening, she clarified with practiced concern. We just think a more limited involvement would be less taxing for you. The photographer has suggested an intimate family portrait session earlier in the day that would include you, before the main event begins. It was a masterly execution of exclusion disguised as consideration, suggesting I was too elderly and frail to fully participate in a celebration happening in my own home, while simultaneously ensuring they maintained access to the property and possessions they wanted to showcase. I see, was all I could manage in the moment, too stunned by the calculated nature of the suggestion to offer more resistance. Wonderful, Melissa replied, clearly interpreting my shock as acceptance. That's settled then. Now about the silver collection. We'll need it available for the caterer's inventory check next week. They'll want to photograph each piece for their records before taking responsibility for it. I nodded mutely, still processing the deeper implications of what had just occurred. It wasn't just about being excluded from parts of the celebration. It was about a fundamental disrespect for my role as both family elder and steward of our shared heritage. It was about treating Willow Creek and its contents as stage dressing rather than the living history Richard and I had worked so hard to preserve. That evening, sitting alone in the library, Richard and I had so lovingly restored, surrounded by the books we had collected together over decades. I considered my options. Direct confrontation seemed unlikely to succeed. Melissa's approach had been too carefully constructed, likely with James's tacit approval. Simply acquiescing felt wrong, a betrayal of the standards Richard and I had always maintained about how family treated one another, about respect for both people and heritage. I found myself drawn to the portrait of Richard that hung above the fireplace. Not a formal painting, but a photograph Catherine had taken of him in the garden, sleeves rolled up, smiling broadly as he leaned on a shovel, the restored fountain sparkling behind him. What would he have advised in this situation? How would he have balanced family harmony with the principles we had built our life around? There was a third path, one that would require careful planning and perfect timing. If Melissa and James valued the trappings of Willow Creek's history more than the family bonds that gave that history meaning, perhaps it was time for some gentle but firm education about the true nature of legacy. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in some time. Margaret Wilson, my dear friend and former colleague from the Historical Preservation Committee, who had gone on to become one of the region's most respected appraisers and authenticators of historical artifacts. Margaret, I said when she answered, I find myself in need of your professional services. How quickly could you provide a formal appraisal and provenance documentation for a substantial silver collection? As I outlined my situation and the beginnings of a plan, I felt a sense of purpose crystallizing. This wasn't just about a social slight or family tension. It was about honoring Richard's memory, about maintaining the integrity of what we had built together, and about ensuring that our family's true heritage, not just its photogenic surface, would be preserved for generations to come. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worthwhile in my 73 years had come without effort and intention. The vow renewal celebration was still 3 weeks away. That gave me just enough time to prepare a response that would honor both the letter and spirit of what Richard and I had always believed about family, heritage, and the responsibilities that came with being the keeper of both. Dancing and socializing. Until the early hours. We think it would be better if you participated in just the daytime elements. I blinked, trying to process what she was suggesting. You mean leave before the reception dinner? But I live here. This is my home. Of course you'd retire to your suite for the evening, she clarified with practiced concern. We just think a more limited involvement would be less taxing for you. The photographer has suggested an intimate family portrait session earlier in the day that would include you, before the main event begins. It was a masterly execution of exclusion disguised as consideration, suggesting I was too elderly and frail to fully participate in a celebration happening in my own home, while simultaneously ensuring they maintained access to the property and possessions they wanted to showcase. I see, was all I could manage in the moment, too stunned by the calculated nature of the suggestion to offer more resistance. Wonderful, Melissa replied, clearly interpreting my shock as acceptance. That's settled then. Now, about the silver collection, we'll need it available for the caterer's inventory check next week. They'll want to photograph each piece for their records before taking responsibility for it. I nodded mutely, still processing the deeper implications of what had just occurred. It wasn't just about being excluded from parts of the celebration. It was about a fundamental disrespect for my role as both family elder and steward of our shared heritage. It was about treating Willow Creek and its contents as stage dressing, rather than the living history Richard and I had worked so hard to preserve. That evening, sitting alone in the library, Richard and I had so lovingly restored, surrounded by the books we had collected together over decades. I considered my options. Direct confrontation seemed unlikely to succeed. Melissa's approach had been too carefully constructed, likely with James's tacit approval. Simply acquiescing felt wrong, a betrayal of the standards Richard and I had always maintained about how family treated one another, about respect for both people and heritage. There was a third path, one that would require careful planning and perfect timing. If Melissa and James valued the trappings of Willow Creek's history more than the family bonds that gave that history meaning, perhaps it was time for some gentle but firm education about the true nature of legacy. I reached for the phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in some time. Margaret Wilson, my dear friend and former colleague from the Historical Preservation Committee, who had gone on to become one of the region's most respected appraisers and authenticators of historical artifacts. Margaret, I said when she answered, I find myself in need of your professional services. How quickly could you provide a formal appraisal and provenance documentation for a substantial silver collection? As I outlined my situation and the beginnings of a plan, I felt a sense of purpose crystallizing. This wasn't just about a social slight or family tension. It was about honoring Richard's memory, about maintaining the integrity of what we had built together, and about ensuring that our family's true heritage, not just its photogenic surface, would be preserved for generations to come. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but then nothing worthwhile in my 73 years had come without effort and intention. The vow renewal celebration was still 3 weeks away. That gave me just enough time to prepare a response that would honor both the letter and spirit of what Richard and I had always believed about family, heritage, and the responsibilities that came with being the keeper of both. The morning after my unsettling conversation with Melissa, I woke with clarity and purpose. If I was to effectively address this situation without creating an irreparable family rift, I needed information, documentation, and a thorough understanding of my legal and ethical position. This wasn't just about asserting my rights, it was about protecting the legacy Richard and I had worked so hard to preserve. My first call was to Catherine. While I hesitated to involve her in a conflict with her brother and sister-in-law, her perspective would be valuable, and she deserved to know what was happening in the family. "Mom?" Her voice carried immediate concern when she answered. "Is everything all right? You don't usually call this early." "Everything's fine, dear," I assured her, though that wasn't entirely truthful. "I wanted to ask your thoughts about something related to James and Melissa's vow renewal." As I explained the situation, the gradual takeover of planning, the dismissal of my concerns about the silver, and finally the suggestion that I be excluded from the evening celebration in my own home, Catherine's silence on the other end of the line grew longer. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with controlled anger. "They can't do that. It's your home, your silver, your family too. Have you spoken to James directly?" "Not yet," I admitted. I wanted to gather my thoughts first, to make sure I wasn't overreacting. "You're not overreacting," Catherine said, firmly. "This is beyond inappropriate. Would you like me to talk to James?" I considered her offer. Having Catherine intervene might seem like I was triangulating the family, creating divisions where I hoped eventually for understanding. "Let me handle it my way first," I decided. "But I appreciate knowing I'm not being unreasonable." After ending the call with Catherine, I spent the morning assembling what I privately called my silver dossier, the comprehensive documentation Richard and I had created over decades of researching and restoring the collection. The original inventory lists from the attic discovery, photographs of each piece before and after restoration, the provenance research tracing the collection's origin to Richard's great-grandfather's commissions from Tiffany & Coers in the 1880s, the maintenance records showing the careful, museum-standard conservation work we had performed. Most importantly, I located the legal documentation that had been drawn up when we purchased Willow Creek Estate. The silver collection, having been abandoned in the attic for decades, had been specifically listed as personal property included in the sale, rather than as family heirlooms to be returned to other relatives. Richard and I had actually offered to return the collection to family members at the time, but his cousin had been emphatic. He wanted a clean break and a straightforward sale with no complications. As I reviewed these documents, a plan began to form, not one of confrontation or ultimatums, but of education. James and Melissa seemed to view the silver and the estate itself as mere backdrop for their social ambitions, props to be arranged according to their preferences with little appreciation for their historical or emotional significance. Perhaps what was needed wasn't resistance but a deeper understanding. My next call was to Margaret Wilson, my friend and former colleague from the Historical Preservation Committee. After 30 years at the State Museum and a second career as an independent appraiser, Margaret had become the region's foremost expert on historical silver and decorative arts. We had worked together on several preservation projects over the years, and she had occasionally consulted on pieces in my collection when Richard and I encountered particular challenges. "Eleanor, what a delightful surprise," Margaret greeted me warmly. "It's been too long since we've had tea in your magnificent garden. How are you?" "In need of your expertise," I replied, explaining the situation with the silver collection and my concerns about its proper handling during the vow renewal. "Of course I remember your collection," Margaret said. "That Georgian soup tureen alone is museum quality. The idea of it being handed off to catering staff without proper supervision is concerning, to say the least." "Exactly my worry," I agreed. "But there's more at stake here than just the physical safety of the pieces." I explained Melissa's dismissal of my concerns and the suggestion that I be excluded from the evening portions of the celebration. Margaret's response was immediate and resolute. "This is precisely why I've spent my career emphasizing the importance of provenance documentation and proper valuation. When objects of significance are treated as mere decorative elements, their deeper value is diminished. That's what I hoped you might help with, I said. I'd like to commission a formal appraisal and authentication of the collection, not for insurance purposes, as we already have that coverage, but for educational documentation. Something that establishes definitively the historical and monetary value of what they're so casually planning to use. I'd be honored, Margaret replied. When would you like me to begin? As soon as possible, I told her. The vow renewal is just 3 weeks away, and I'd like to have comprehensive documentation before their caterer arrives for the inventory check next week. We arranged for Margaret to visit the following day, bringing her specialized equipment for examining maker's marks and photographing the collection under proper lighting conditions. Unlike the routine insurance appraisals I had obtained over the years, this would be a museum-standard evaluation with detailed historical context and comparative market analysis. Before we ended our call, Margaret added one more thought. Eleanor, have you considered having the collection professionally cleaned and restored before the event? Not that your maintenance hasn't been excellent, but a professional conservation service could bring out details that might have been missed and ensure each piece is in optimal condition. The suggestion sparked an idea that would become central to my plan. Do you still work with that conservation studio in the city? The one that handles pieces for the Metropolitan? Silverman and Daughters? Absolutely. They're the best in the region, possibly the country. Their waiting list is typically months long, but I could call in a favor if you're interested. I am very interested, I confirmed, the pieces of my plan falling into place. Could you arrange a consultation as soon as possible? After ending the call with Margaret, I made myself a cup of tea and carried it out to the garden, settling on the bench Richard had built beneath the ancient oak tree that had witnessed generations of family history. This spot had always provided clarity when difficult decisions needed to be made. The dappled sunlight and gentle rustle of leaves creating a sense of timelessness that put present challenges into perspective. What I was considering wasn't about revenge or even asserting control. It was about establishing proper boundaries while hopefully educating James and Melissa about the true meaning of the legacy they seemed eager to appropriate but reluctant to truly understand. If they wanted to use the material trappings of family history while excluding the family keeper of that history, perhaps they needed to learn that heritage isn't merely decorative. It carries obligations and deeper meaning than they had considered. Over the next several days, my home became a center of careful activity as Margaret conducted her appraisal. She arrived with specialized equipment, magnifiers, specialized lights, digital cameras with macro lenses, and reference books filled with hallmarks and maker's stamps. We transformed the dining room into a temporary conservation studio with acid-free paper covering the table and cotton gloves for handling each piece. This Tiffany water pitcher is exceptional, Margaret observed as she carefully examined the elaborate repoussé work depicting native flora around the base. The condition is remarkable considering its age. You can see here. She pointed to a tiny mark inside the rim. This is John Seymour's touch mark. He was Tiffany's primary silversmith in the 1850s before the company expanded. This predates the rest of your set by nearly 3 decades. Richard found documentation suggesting it was a wedding gift to his great-grandmother, I explained, watching as Margaret photographed the mark and made detailed notes. The rest of the set was commissioned to complement it when the family's fortunes improved in the 1880s. We continued this process for hours each day, examining every piece in the collection, from the magnificent centerpieces and candelabras to the specialized utensils whose purposes had become obscure over time. Margaret's expertise revealed details even Richard and I had missed despite our years of research, makers' variations that established precise dates, stylistic elements that connected our pieces to significant historical events or artistic movements, repair marks that told stories of previous generations' care for these treasures. By the 3rd day, Margaret had compiled enough information to provide preliminary findings. Based on current market values and the exceptional provenance, I would place the collection's value at approximately $375,000, she informed me over tea in the library. However, that figure reflects only the monetary value. The historical significance, particularly the documented connection to your family across 5 generations, adds a dimension that can't be quantified but substantially enhances its cultural importance. The figure was considerably higher than my last insurance appraisal from 5 years earlier, reflecting both the rising market for American silver from prestigious makers and Margaret's more comprehensive evaluation. But it was the second part of her assessment, the unquantifiable historical and cultural value, that resonated most deeply with me. "I've prepared a preliminary report," she continued, handing me a leather portfolio containing photographs and detailed descriptions. "The full appraisal with complete historical documentation will take another week, but this provides the essential information about significance, value, and proper handling requirements." The report was impressive, professionally presented with archival quality photographs and scholarly descriptions of each major piece. It read like a museum catalog, placing our family silver in the broader context of American decorative arts history, while highlighting its exceptional condition and complete provenance. "This is exactly what I hoped for," I told her gratefully. "It captures not just what these pieces are worth, but why they matter." "Precisely my intention," Margaret replied with a satisfied nod. "Now, about Silverman and Daughters. They've agreed to assess the collection tomorrow. Their senior conservator is coming personally, which is quite extraordinary given their usual schedule." The visit from Silverman and Daughters the following day added another layer to my growing documentation. David Silverman, a third-generation silver conservator whose clients included major museums and private collectors, spent hours examining key pieces from the collection, his trained eye identifying subtle issues that even Margaret and I had missed. "You've done remarkably well with the maintenance," he assured me, as he delicately turned a Georgian soup ladle under his specialized light. "But there are conservation techniques that have evolved significantly in recent years. We can now address tarnish at the molecular level without abrasives, preserve patina while enhancing luster, and stabilize microfissures that might eventually lead to structural problems." "What would the process involve?" I asked, already anticipating how this might fit into my developing plan. "Ideally, we would take the entire collection to our studio for about 2 weeks," he explained. "Each piece would be documented, treated according to its specific needs, and returned with a complete conservation report and maintenance guidelines." 2 weeks, I repeated thoughtfully. "And this would need to happen immediately to address everything properly?" "Given what I'm seeing, yes. Some of these pieces show early signs of issues that could become problematic if not addressed soon. Nothing urgent, but conservation is always better undertaken proactively rather than reactively." "I completely agree," I said, making my decision. "Please prepare a formal proposal for the complete conservation treatment of the collection, beginning as soon as possible." By the time James and Melissa arrived for their next planning visit 2 days later, I had assembled everything I needed: Margaret's preliminary appraisal report, Silverman's detailed conservation proposal, the original ownership documentation, and a carefully considered approach that I hoped would educate rather than alienate. They arrived in the late afternoon, accompanied by Simone, their event planner, all 3 carrying tablets and sample books for what had become an increasingly elaborate event. I welcomed them in the front parlor rather than the kitchen where we usually gathered, setting a slightly more formal tone that matched the seriousness of the conversation to come. "Before we discuss further plans for the celebration," I began, once they were seated, "there are some matters regarding the silver collection that we need to address." Melissa exchanged a quick glance with Simone. "We've already arranged for the caterer's inventory check next Monday. They'll handle everything professionally, as I mentioned." "That's partly what I need to discuss," I replied, opening Margaret's portfolio on the coffee table between us. "I've had the collection formally appraised and assessed by conservation specialists over the past week. There are considerations about its use that go beyond what a typical catering service might be equipped to handle. James leaned forward with sudden interest, always attuned to financial matters. An appraisal? What prompted that? Responsible stewardship, I answered simply, turning to the summary page that listed the collection's total value. The collection is worth considerably more than our previous insurance estimates indicated, approximately $375,000 in current market value, with several individual pieces classified as museum quality. The figure had the intended effect. James's eyebrows rose dramatically, while Melissa's expression shifted from mild annoyance to sudden attentiveness. Additionally, I continued, conservation specialists have identified several pieces that require immediate professional treatment to address early signs of structural vulnerability, particularly concerning for items that might be subjected to the handling involved in a formal dinner service. I slid the conservation proposal across the table, open to the page detailing the specialized treatments recommended for the soup tureen and fish service that I knew Melissa had specifically mentioned wanting to use. The conservators have recommended a complete treatment process for the entire collection, which would require sending it to their studio for approximately 2 weeks. They can begin tomorrow and have everything back shortly after your celebration. Tomorrow. Melissa's voice rose slightly. But we need it for the dinner. That's been part of the plan from the beginning. The photographer has already designed shots featuring the head table with the candelabras and centerpieces. I understand that's disappointing, I said with genuine sympathy. Unfortunately, the conservation assessment makes it clear that using the pieces without proper treatment would risk permanent damage. As the collection's steward, I have a responsibility to ensure its preservation. Surely some pieces could remain, James suggested, his tone reasoned but with an underlying tension. Perhaps just the display items that wouldn't actually be used for serving? I shook my head regretfully. The conservators were quite clear that the entire collection needs treatment as a unified set. The environmental factors affecting one piece likely impact all of them. It would be irresponsible to withhold any pieces from proper conservation once issues have been identified. But, Melissa began, then stopped abruptly, visibly recalibrating her approach. Mother Harrington, I understand your concern for these valuable items. What if we arranged for specialized insurance coverage just for the event? Would that address your concerns? It was a reasonable attempt at compromise, but it missed the fundamental point. Insurance could compensate for monetary loss, but it can't replace historical significance or family legacy, I explained gently. These pieces aren't valuable primarily because of their market worth, but because of their connection to 5 generations of family history. I turned to another section of Margaret's report, showing photographs of maker's marks and handwritten provenance notes. This sugar bowl, for instance, was purchased to celebrate the birth of Richard's grandfather in 1892. These serving spoons were used at family Thanksgiving dinners throughout the Great Depression, when maintaining such traditions provided stability during uncertain times. Each piece carries stories that insurance simply can't protect or replace. James was studying me with new awareness, perhaps recognizing that this wasn't merely about control or inconvenience, but about principles that ran deeper than he had considered. You've always taken exceptional care of the collection, he acknowledged slowly. If the conservators believe treatment is necessary, I respect that judgment. Melissa wasn't ready to concede so easily. What about after conservation? Once the collection has been properly treated, would you reconsider allowing us to use it for special occasions? Perhaps for next year's holiday dinner? Her question revealed that she still viewed the issue as primarily about permission and access, rather than understanding the deeper responsibilities of stewardship. It was time for the final element of my approach. That brings me to another matter I've been considering, I said, retrieving the original property documentation from my folder. In reviewing these records, I was reminded that the silver collection is legally my personal property, not a family heirloom in the traditional sense. When your father and I purchased Willow Creek, the silver had been abandoned in the attic for decades. It was explicitly included in the sale as personal property, not as an inherited item to be held in trust for future generations. I paused to let this information register. It wasn't something I had ever emphasized before, as Richard and I had always treated the collection as part of the family's shared heritage despite its legal status as our personal property. Given its significance and the care required for its preservation, I've decided to donate the entire collection to the Millfield Historical Society's museum after the conservation is complete, I continued, watching their expressions carefully. They have a dedicated silver gallery, with proper climate control and security, and the curator has expressed interest in creating a special exhibition about local family histories as told through decorative arts. Our collection would be the centerpiece, documented with the stories and photographs we've assembled over the years. The stunned silence that followed was exactly what I had anticipated. This wasn't the outcome either of them had expected from a conversation that began about temporary usage for an event. "Donate it?" James finally asked, his voice unusually quiet. "All of it? But I always assumed—" He trailed off, perhaps realizing for the first time that he had taken for granted both the collection's availability and my permanent role as its caretaker. The museum would ensure its preservation and make it accessible to researchers and the public, I explained. Our family history would be honored and shared rather than eventually dispersed as individual pieces passed to different branches of the family without their context and stories. "But what about future family gatherings?" Melissa asked, genuine disappointment evident in her voice. "The holiday dinners and special occasions when we've always used the silver?" Her question revealed a surprising attachment to traditions she had previously seemed to find outdated and inconvenient. Perhaps the silver's meaning to her was more complex than I had realized. "The museum curator and I have discussed a special arrangement," I said, offering the compromise I had planned from the beginning. For significant family occasions, select pieces could be borrowed with proper handling protocols in place. The museum would provide conservation staff to oversee their use, ensuring both accessibility for important traditions and professional care for the collection. The balance of expressions crossing their faces, disappointment, consideration, and slow understanding, suggested my approach was having the intended effect. This wasn't about denying them access to family heritage. It was about establishing a framework that honored that heritage's true significance. "I hadn't realized how valuable the collection is," James said finally. "Not just monetarily, but historically. You and Dad really did preserve something extraordinary." "We tried," I acknowledged, feeling a wave of emotion at this recognition of what had been our life's work. "Your father believed that preserving the past wasn't about clinging to it, but about honoring the craftsmanship and care that previous generations invested in creating beautiful, lasting things." A thoughtful silence settled over the room as each of us considered the implications of this conversation. After a moment, Simone discreetly checked her watch and whispered something to Melissa, who nodded. "We should probably reschedule our planning session," Melissa said, her tone more subdued than I had heard it in weeks. "There are clearly adjustments we need to make to our concept given this new information." As they gathered their materials to leave, James hung back slightly, letting Melissa and Simone proceed to the front door without him. "Mom," he said quietly when they were out of earshot, "is this decision about the donation? Is it related to Melissa suggesting you not participate in the evening celebration?" The directness of his question surprised me. I hadn't been certain. He was even aware of that conversation, which suggested Melissa had indeed discussed it with him afterward. "No, James," I answered honestly. "The conservation needs are genuine, and the donation has been something I've considered for several years. But I won't pretend that being excluded from a family celebration in my own home didn't prompt me to finalize decisions I might otherwise have continued to defer." He nodded slowly, accepting this difficult truth. "I should have been more attentive," To the planning process, he admitted. Melissa sometimes gets carried away with creating the perfect image, and I haven't always helped her understand our family's values around substance over appearance. We all have different priorities, I acknowledged, not wanting to criticize his wife directly. What matters is finding ways to respect each other's values even when they differ from our own. I'll talk to her, he promised. About the evening. Celebration plans. That shouldn't have happened, and it won't stand. Thank you, I said simply, touched by his willingness to address the situation directly. As he turned to leave, I added, James, the collection will be going to the museum, eventually regardless, but the timing is flexible. If conserving it after your celebration rather than before would make a meaningful difference to you both, we could discuss that possibility. He considered this for a moment, then shook his head. No, you're making the right decision. If the pieces need professional treatment, that should take priority over using them for one evening, no matter how special. There will be other ways to incorporate family heritage into our celebration. As I watched them drive away, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Satisfaction that my approach had initiated what seemed to be genuine reflection, sadness that such measures had been necessary at all, and cautious hope that this might lead to a more authentic relationship with James and Melissa moving forward. That evening, I sat in Richard's favorite chair in the library, surrounded by the books and photographs that documented our decades of historical research and restoration work. I could almost hear his voice offering his perspective on the day's events. You've done the right thing, Eleanor, he would have said. Not just for the silver, but for James and Melissa, too. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give the next generation isn't the objects themselves, but the understanding of why they matter. Whether they would fully embrace that understanding remained to be seen, but at least the conversation had begun. The silver collection would be properly conserved, its historical significance formally documented, and its future preservation ensured. More importantly, perhaps, the experience might help James and Melissa recognize that true legacy isn't about possessing beautiful objects or creating perfect appearances, but about honoring the values, stories, and relationships that give those objects meaning. The following morning, representatives from Silverman and Daughters arrived with specialized packing materials and a climate-controlled vehicle to transport the silver collection to their conservation studio. As I watched them carefully wrapping each piece in acid-free tissue and custom-fitted foam supports, I felt not loss but a sense of fulfillment. These treasures that Richard and I had rescued from neglect and obscurity were continuing their journey, not as mere decorative objects, but as honored carriers of history and meaning. Catherine called later that day, eager to hear how James and Melissa had responded to my decision. They were surprised, I told her, but I think also enlightened. James, particularly, seemed to gain a new appreciation for what your father and I were trying to preserve all these years. And the vow renewal? She asked. Has anything changed about their plans for your participation? James indicated he would speak to Melissa about reconsidering the evening arrangements, I replied. But honestly, that's become secondary to the larger issue of helping them understand what true stewardship of family heritage entails. That's very generous of you, Mom, Catherine said warmly. Though I'm still furious on your behalf about how they've handled this entire situation. I'm choosing to see it as an opportunity, I told her. Sometimes the most meaningful lessons come through challenging experiences. Your father always said that preservation isn't just about protecting physical objects. It's about keeping alive the values and stories they represent. Perhaps this situation will help James and Melissa understand that perspective in a way they haven't before. As I continued preparations for the museum donation, organizing our research notes, selecting photographs that documented the collection's restoration, and working with the curator on educational materials to accompany the exhibition, I found myself reflecting on the nature of legacy. The silver pieces themselves, beautiful and valuable as they were, represented only the visible manifestation of what Richard and I had tried to preserve. The deeper legacy lay in the values of craftsmanship, stewardship, and meaningful connection to history that we had hoped to instill in our children and grandchildren. Whether that legacy would flourish in James and Melissa's understanding remained uncertain, but I had done what I could to plant the seeds of appreciation, and in ensuring that the collection would be professionally preserved and shared with the broader community, I had honored Richard's vision that beautiful, meaningful things should be not just possessed, but properly valued and understood. 2 days later, an unexpected package arrived from James and Melissa, a leather-bound album with a simple note: "We've been reconsidering what matters most about the vow renewal celebration. Here's our revised concept. With love and respect, James and Melissa." Inside, I found a completely reimagined event plan. Gone were the architectural floral arrangements and minimalist aesthetic that had seemed so at odds with Willow Creek's historical character. In their place was a thoughtfully designed celebration that honored both tradition and personal meaning. Photographs of the garden as it was, without temporary modifications. Menu selections that incorporated family recipes. And most touchingly, a prominently featured display about the history of Willow Creek Estate, including photographs of Richard and me during the restoration process. The final page addressed the question of my participation directly. The evening celebration will center around family stories shared by all generations, with Eleanor as our honored guide through Willow Creek's history and the values it represents. All events will conclude at a reasonable hour out of respect for all participants. As I closed the album, I felt the warm certainty that Richard would have approved of this outcome. Not because we had maintained control, or because our preferences had prevailed, but because understanding had grown where there had been only conflict. The silver collection would be preserved through professional conservation and eventual museum donation, but more importantly, its true significance, the values and connections it represented, might now be appreciated in ways that would continue, long after the physical objects themselves had passed from our direct stewardship. In choosing to address the situation through education rather than confrontation, I had renewed something far more valuable than silver: the prospect of genuine understanding between generations with different perspectives, but shared heritage. And in that renewal lay the true legacy that Richard and I had always hoped to create. The week before James and Melissa's vow renewal ceremony brought unexpected transformations in our plans, in our family relationships, and in my own understanding of what it truly means to preserve a legacy. The changes began with a phone call that arrived 3 days after I had sent the silver collection for professional conservation. "Eleanor, it's James. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Something in his voice, a hesitancy I rarely heard from my typically confident son, told me this conversation would be significant. "Of course, dear. Is everything all right?" "Yes. And no," he said, the slight pause revealing careful consideration of his words. "Melissa and I have been doing a lot of thinking since our last conversation. We'd like to come see you. Just the two of us, no event planners or caterers. Would tomorrow evening work?" 24 hours later, we sat in the garden where generations of family conversations had unfolded, some celebratory, some difficult, all part of the complex tapestry of relationships that shaped our shared history. The evening light filtered through the ancient oak trees, casting long shadows across the lawn as the first fireflies of the season began to appear. "First," James began, once we were settled with glasses of iced tea, "we owe you an apology. The way the vow renewal planning evolved was disrespectful to you and to everything you and Dad created here, especially the suggestion that you should be excluded from part of the celebration in your own home." Melissa nodded, her usual polished confidence softened by what appeared to be genuine remorse. I was so focused on creating what I thought would be the perfect event that I lost sight of what should have mattered most: honoring family bonds and respecting the home that has sheltered so many important moments in James's life. Their sincerity touched me deeply. In my 73 years, I had learned that genuine apologies, those that acknowledge specific actions without qualifications or deflections, were rare and valuable offerings. "Thank you both," I said simply. "That means a great deal to me." "There's more," James continued, exchanging a glance with Melissa. "After you showed us the appraisal and conservation reports for the silver collection, we started really looking at Willow Creek differently. Not just as an impressive backdrop, but as something with layers of history and meaning we hadn't fully appreciated. We spent hours going through the family albums in James's study," Melissa added, "seeing photographs of you and Richard restoring this place room by room, the befores and afters, the careful research that went into each decision. It was humbling. We realized how little we understood about what you two accomplished here." James reached for a portfolio they had brought with them. "We've completely reconsidered our approach to the vow renewal. We'd like your input on this revised concept." What they presented was a transformation indeed, not an abandonment of their original vision, but a thoughtful integration of modern celebration with genuine respect for Willow Creek's historical character. Instead of attempting to mask or override the home's authentic features, the new plan worked harmoniously with them, highlighting rather than hiding the elements that made the estate unique. "We're still bringing in contemporary touches," Melissa explained, showing me mood boards that featured elegant but simpler decorations. "But now they're designed to complement the existing beauty rather than compete with it." Most meaningful, to me, was the central role they now envisioned for family history in the celebration. A display table would feature photographs of multiple generations at Willow Creek, including restoration images showing Richard and me at work. The ceremony readings would include passages about heritage and continuity that had been meaningful to our family over the years. "And most importantly," James said, meeting my eyes directly, "we want you present for every moment of the celebration, not just the early portions. In fact, we're hoping you'll share some stories about the estate's history during the dinner. No one can bring those memories to life the way you can." The sincerity of their reconsideration brought tears to my eyes, not just because my feelings had been acknowledged, but because they seemed to have genuinely grasped something deeper about the meaning of Willow Creek and the traditions it embodied. "This is lovely," I told them, paging through their revised plans. "Truly, it honors both your vision for your celebration and the history that makes this place special." "There's one more thing," Melissa said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing an envelope. "We've been thinking about your decision to donate the silver collection to the museum. While we completely understand and support ensuring its preservation, we wondered if you might consider an alternative that would keep it accessible to the family while still providing proper care." She handed me the envelope, which contained a formal proposal from the Millfield Historical Society. As I read through it, I realized that James and Melissa had been doing far more than simply revising their event plans during the past several days. The proposal outlined a special endowment to be established in Richard's name, funded by James and Melissa, that would create a dedicated conservation fund for the silver collection. The collection would remain officially mine, and eventually the family's, but would be placed on long-term loan to the museum, where it would be professionally maintained, selectively displayed, and, this was clearly their addition, made available for significant family celebrations with proper museum supervision. "We spoke with the museum director," James explained. "They were actually quite excited about the possibility of this arrangement. Apparently, it's become something of a model in the museum world, private collections remaining in family ownership, but with professional institutional care. This way," Melissa added, "the collection remains part of our family's living traditions while receiving the preservation care it deserves. The endowment ensures that the museum won't bear any financial burden for its maintenance." I was momentarily speechless, moved by the thoughtfulness of their proposal. It represented exactly the balance I had hoped to achieve: professional preservation of the collection's physical integrity, alongside continued connection to the family rituals and celebrations that gave it meaning. "This is extraordinarily thoughtful," I finally managed, genuinely impressed by their initiative and the care they had taken to create a solution that addressed all aspects of my concerns. "The museum would still create the exhibition about the collection and our family history," James added. "But with this arrangement, the story wouldn't have an ending. It would continue to evolve as future generations use and appreciate these pieces for their own celebrations." As we continued discussing the details, the specific terms of the endowment, the conservation protocols, the procedures for borrowing pieces for family events, I found myself marveling at the transformation. In James and Melissa's perspective, what had begun as a conflict over a single celebration had evolved into a deeper conversation about legacy, continuity, and the true meaning of family heritage. Later that evening, after they had departed with plans to return the following week, for further discussion of the vow renewal details, I sat in Richard's favorite chair in the library, surrounded by the books and research materials we had collected during our decades of restoration work. I could almost hear his gentle laughter, could imagine exactly what he would say about this unexpected turn of events. "You see, Eleanor, sometimes people just need the right kind of education, not lectures or demands, but experiences that help them truly understand what matters." That had always been Richard's approach: patient explanation, practical demonstration, and faith that given time and proper information, people would recognize the value of preservation, both of physical objects and of the intangible heritage they represented. The days leading up to the vow renewal took on a different rhythm than I had anticipated. Instead of tense planning sessions dominated by Melissa's event coordinator, there were thoughtful family conversations about which traditions to incorporate and how to balance innovation with respect for history. Catherine and her daughters became involved, contributing ideas for how to honor Richard's memory during the celebration. Even Melissa's parents, whom I had always found somewhat standoffish, showed genuine interest in learning about Willow Creek's history and the restoration work Richard and I had undertaken. Perhaps most surprisingly, Melissa herself began spending time with me in the archives room where Richard and I had organized our research materials, photographs, and documentation of the estate's history. What had started as research for the celebration's historical display evolved into genuine curiosity about architectural details, period-appropriate gardening techniques, and the stories behind various features of the house. "I never realized how many deliberate decisions went into preserving a place like this," she admitted one afternoon as we reviewed photographs of the library restoration. "I always thought historical homes were just maintained. I didn't understand that preservation requires actively choosing which period to honor, which changes to keep, and which to reverse." "That was one of the first lessons Richard and I learned," I told her, showing her the notebooks where we had debated various approaches to each room. "Preservation isn't about freezing a place in time. It's about making thoughtful choices about which stories the house should tell." These conversations revealed a side of Melissa I hadn't seen before: genuinely curious, less concerned with appearances, and capable of appreciating substance over style when given the opportunity to understand the difference. I began to see that her emphasis on perfect presentation might have come from insecurity rather than superficiality, a desire to prove her worth through flawless execution rather than authentic connection. As we worked together on elements of the vow renewal, I found myself sharing not just historical information, but personal stories. The challenges Richard and I had faced during the restoration, the discoveries that had delighted us, the mistakes we had made and learned from. Gradually, the stiff formality that had characterized our relationship began to soften into something more genuine. "I wish I had asked about all this sooner," Melissa said one evening as we finished selecting photographs for the historical display. I've always felt a bit intimidated by Willow Creek, by how perfect everything is, how much history and knowledge is embedded in every corner. It seemed easier to impose my own vision than to try to understand yours. Willow Creek isn't perfect, I assured her with a smile. It's authentic, which means it shows its age and its history honestly. That's something Richard and I always valued more than perfection. The Silver Collection, meanwhile, was undergoing its own transformation at Silverman and Daughters Conservation Studio. David Silverman sent regular updates with photographs showing the meticulous work being performed on each piece. Gentle removal of decades of accumulated polish residue from intricate details, stabilization of worn areas, responsible treatment of tarnish that preserved patina while preventing further oxidation. Your previous maintenance was excellent, he assured me during one update call. We're simply addressing issues that weren't visible without specialized equipment and applying treatments that weren't available to collectors until recently. When the collection returns, you'll see details that have been obscured for generations. The week of the vow renewal arrived, bringing with it the usual flurry of last-minute preparations, but now characterized by cooperation rather than conflict. The garden had never looked more beautiful, with early summer roses in full bloom, and the herb borders offering their subtle fragrance to the evening air. The house itself seemed to glow with anticipation, its rooms arranged to highlight both historical features and the contemporary touches Melissa had chosen to complement them. The morning of the ceremony, I woke to find a small package outside my bedroom door, wrapped in simple cream paper with a handwritten note from James and Melissa. A small token of appreciation for all you've taught us about the true meaning of family heritage. Inside was a beautifully bound book, a complete photographic documentation of the Silver Collection's conservation process, showing before, during, and nearly completed after images of each major piece. David Silverman had provided detailed notes explaining the techniques used and the historical significance revealed through the conservation work. The final pages contain the formal loan agreement with the Historical Society, officially establishing the Richard Harrington Conservation Endowment and ensuring the collection's proper care in perpetuity while maintaining its connection to family celebrations. It was the perfect gift, not a material object, but a promise that what Richard and I had worked to preserve would continue to be valued, protected, and understood by future generations. For the first time since this journey began, I felt the full weight of concern lift from my shoulders. The vow renewal itself unfolded like a dream, more meaningful and emotionally resonant than I could have imagined when the planning first began. The garden ceremony captured both the timeless beauty of Willow Creek and the genuine love between James and Melissa as they recommitted to their marriage. Rather than the stiffly formal aesthetic Melissa had initially envisioned, there was an organic elegance that felt both contemporary and respectful of tradition. During the dinner that followed, I found myself seated in a position of honor, with James and Melissa on either side. When the time came for toasts, James stood and addressed the gathered family and friends. 5 years ago, Melissa and I exchanged vows in a beautiful ceremony. But I don't think either of us fully understood what we were committing to beyond our love for each other. Today, as we renew those promises, we have a deeper appreciation for what marriage truly means. Not just a relationship between two people, but a link in a chain of family history that stretches backward and forward. Across generations, he turned to me, raising his glass. My mother and father taught me through their example that the most valuable things in life aren't possessions, but commitments to each other, to the places and traditions we cherish, and to preserving what matters for those who will come after us. Mom, thank you for that lesson, which has taken me far too long to fully appreciate. Melissa rose to join him, her own glass raised. To Eleanor, who has shown me that true elegance isn't about perfect appearances, but about authenticity and meaning. Thank you for your patience, your wisdom, and for welcoming me into this incredible legacy that you and Richard created. As applause filled the dining room, I felt Richard's presence so strongly it nearly took my breath away. Not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the living influence he continued to have through the values and vision we had shared. He would have loved this moment of genuine appreciation for what we had tried to build together. Later in the evening, as promised, I shared stories about Willow Creek's history with the gathered guests. Not the rehearsed, sanitized version that might have been deemed appropriate for important business associates, but authentic accounts of challenges overcome, discoveries made, and the sometimes messy, always rewarding process of bringing a neglected treasure back to life. To my surprise, these unvarnished stories captivated not just family members, but the corporate colleagues James had been so concerned about impressing. Several approached me afterward to ask questions about specific restoration techniques or to share experiences with their own historical properties. What James and Melissa had feared might seem unprofessional or unpolished instead created genuine connections based on shared appreciation for craftsmanship and heritage. As midnight approached, I found myself not excluded in my private quarters as originally planned, but seated on the terrace with Catherine, watching the dancing that continued in the garden below. The pathways were illuminated with discreet lighting that highlighted the historical landscaping while creating a magical atmosphere for the celebration. "This turned out rather differently than you expected, didn't it?" Catherine observed, a hint of amused satisfaction in her voice. "In the best possible way, I agreed, though I admit I'm surprised by how completely James and Melissa's perspective seems to have changed. I was hoping for respect and consideration, not this level of genuine understanding and appreciation." Catherine smiled knowingly. "Sometimes, people just need the right motivation to open their eyes. James has always valued Dad's approval, even after his passing. Realizing that he was failing to honor Dad's legacy by treating you in this place as mere backdrop rather than living history, that was powerful motivation for him to reconsider his approach." "And Melissa?" "I think Melissa has been searching for authentic connection to family tradition that her own background didn't provide," Catherine suggested thoughtfully. "Once she understood that those traditions can't simply be acquired or staged, but need to be understood and honored, something clicked for her. Whatever the reasons, the transformation seemed genuine. The days following the vow renewal brought further evidence of their changed perspective." James and Melissa extended their stay at Willow Creek beyond the celebration, spending time not just relaxing, but actively engaging with projects I had been planning. Helping clear a section of the woods for a new heritage garden, sorting through architectural salvage in the carriage house to identify pieces for future restoration, even accompanying me to a historical society meeting about preservation advocacy. 2 weeks after the ceremony, David Silverman himself delivered the conserved silver collection. The presentation became an impromptu family gathering, with Catherine and her daughters joining James, Melissa, and me in the dining room as each piece was carefully unpacked and its conservation explained. "This teapot exhibits some of the most intricate repoussé work I've seen from this period," David explained, handling a piece that had been in the family since the 1880s. The conservation process revealed maker's marks that had been obscured by years of polishing compound buildup. We now know it was crafted by an apprentice who later became one of Tiffany's most sought-after silversmiths. The collection gleamed with new life, each piece revealing details that had been hidden for decades. Delicate engraving that told stories of its era, subtle monograms that connected it to specific family members, hallmarks that established its provenance beyond any doubt. But most importantly, the collection now had a secure future, professionally maintained through the endowment James and Melissa had established, properly documented thanks to Margaret's appraisal, and still connected to the family celebrations that gave it meaning. As we admired the transformation, I noticed Melissa watching me with unexpected emotion in her eyes. "What is it?" I asked gently. "I was just thinking about how differently this could have turned out," she admitted quietly. "If you had simply acquiesced to our original plans, let us use the silver without understanding its significance, accepted being excluded from parts of the celebration, we would never have learned what we needed to learn. Your resistance wasn't stubborn or difficult. It was the greatest gift you could have given us. Her insight touched me deeply. What had begun as a defense of my own dignity and the respect due to Richard's memory had evolved into something far more important. An opportunity for genuine understanding across generational divides about the true meaning of heritage and legacy. The silver collection was eventually transported to the museum as planned, not as a permanent donation, but as a long-term loan, under the protection of the Richard Harrington Conservation Endowment. Selected pieces were displayed in a beautiful exhibition about family silver traditions in Victorian-era Millfield, with photographs and documentation from our decades of research providing historical context. Other pieces were securely stored in climate-controlled conditions, available for rotation into the display or for borrowing during significant family celebrations. As I walked through the exhibition on opening night, surrounded by 3 generations of family and friends from the Historical Society, I felt a profound sense of completion. The collection that Richard and I had rescued from obscurity in a forgotten attic had found its perfect balance, professionally preserved for future generations while remaining connected to the family whose history it embodied. The most unexpected outcome of this journey emerged in the months that followed. What began as Melissa's grudging education in historical preservation evolved into genuine passion. She began accompanying me to Historical Society meetings, gradually shifting from silent observer to active participant. Her professional background in event planning found new purpose as she helped organize fundraising activities for preservation projects throughout Millfield, bringing contemporary marketing strategies to traditional causes. I've been thinking about focusing my business in a new direction, she confided during one of our now regular Sunday afternoon teas in the garden. There's a real need for someone who understands both authentic historical preservation and contemporary presentation. So many historical properties struggle with making their significance relevant to modern audiences without compromising their integrity. That's something Richard and I discussed often, I told her, delighted by this unexpected evolution. Finding the balance between accessibility and authenticity is one of preservation's greatest challenges. Within a year, Melissa had launched a specialized consulting firm focused on helping historical properties and museums create engaging programming that respected historical integrity while appealing to contemporary visitors. Her first major client was the Millfield Historical Society itself, which saw record attendance for its annual Homes Tour after implementing her recommendations for presentation and community engagement. James, too, found his perspective transformed by our experience. His corporate expertise in finance found new application in helping establish sustainable endowment structures for preservation projects. Together, he and Melissa became unexpected but effective advocates for heritage conservation, bringing their professional skills to a field that often struggled with financial sustainability and public engagement. As for me, what had begun as a painful exclusion evolved into one of the most rewarding chapters of my stewardship of Willow Creek Estate. The conflict over the silver collection and vow renewal had catalyzed a deeper appreciation of the legacy Richard and I had built. Not just in our children, but in the broader community. The attention brought to our preservation work through the museum exhibition and Melissa's new professional focus created opportunities to share our knowledge and vision with a wider audience than we had ever anticipated. 3 years after the vow renewal, on the 30th anniversary of purchasing Willow Creek, we hosted a special celebration that brought together family, friends, and preservation enthusiasts from across the region. The beautifully conserved silver collection was borrowed from the museum for the occasion, gleaming on tables throughout the house, just as it had during the grand entertainments of the Victorian era. As I watched 4 generations of family moving through rooms that Richard and I had painstakingly restored, I felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that our work would continue. Catherine's daughters had both developed specific preservation interests: Emily in textile conservation and Sophie in architectural documentation. James and Melissa's children were growing up with a deep appreciation for heritage that balanced respect for history with a commitment to making that history relevant to contemporary life. The silver collection that had become the catalyst for this transformation had found its perfect role, neither hidden away as unapproachable museum pieces nor treated as mere decorative objects without context or significance. Like Willow Creek itself, the collection had become a living bridge between past and future, professionally preserved but actively connected to the family whose history it embodied. That evening, as the celebration continued around me, I found a quiet moment to visit the library, Richard's favorite room and the heart of our preservation research over the decades. Standing before his portrait, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for how this challenging journey had unfolded. "You were right, as usual," I whispered to his smiling image. "The most important thing we preserved wasn't the silver, or even the house itself, but the values and understanding that give these physical objects meaning. That's the legacy that will outlast everything else." In the end, what had begun as an exclusion, my son's wife telling me I couldn't attend their vow renewal, had catalyzed a renewal far more significant than any ceremony could capture. It had renewed understanding between generations, renewed commitment to the values Richard and I had tried to embody, and renewed appreciation for the difference between possessing heritage and truly honoring it. The silver collection gleamed in its museum display, professionally conserved, but still connected to family celebrations. Willow Creek continued to evolve, balancing historical authenticity with the needs of a living family home. And most importantly, the knowledge and values Richard and I had worked to preserve found new expression in the next generation, ensuring that our life's work would continue long after we were gone. That, I realized, was the greatest renewal of all. Not of objects, but of the understanding that gives them meaning. Not of appearances, but of the authentic connections that transform mere possessions into true legacy. Final shot. Eleanor sitting on the porch swing at sunset, watching her grandchildren and great-grandchildren playing on the lawn, with the beautifully preserved Willow Creek estate standing proudly in the background. So that's my story, how an attempted exclusion led to unexpected growth and renewal instead of bitterness or loss. If you're watching this and finding yourself in the midst of a family conflict that seems insurmountable, remember that knowledge and preparation are powerful tools for positive transformation. Sometimes the greatest gift we can offer isn't acquiescence, to keep the peace, but the courage to stand for deeper values in ways that create opportunities for genuine understanding. And if you're a keeper of family heritage yourself, consider taking the proactive steps that helped me navigate this challenging situation. Document your treasures professionally, understand their true significance beyond monetary value, and find ways to share not just the objects themselves, but the stories and values they represent. 5 years have passed since that pivotal summer, when a vow renewal ceremony unexpectedly became the catalyst for profound change in my family. At 78, I find myself reflecting on how moments of conflict can sometimes open doors to understanding that might otherwise remain forever closed. Today, I'm sitting in what the Millfield Historical Society now calls the Harrington Gallery, a dedicated space housing the silver collection that once nearly drove a wedge between generations, but ultimately brought us closer together. The elegant display cases that surround me represent far more than preserved artifacts. They embody a new balance we've discovered between honoring the past and embracing the future. The silver pieces gleam under carefully calibrated lighting, designed to highlight their craftsmanship without accelerating tarnish or deterioration. Each item is accompanied by not just dates and maker's marks, but by family stories, the celebrations where they were used, the hands that polished them, the moments in history they witnessed. Visitors often tell me they feel they're meeting my family rather than merely viewing objects behind glass. What gives me the greatest satisfaction, however, isn't the professional preservation or public appreciation of these treasures. It's the deeper understanding that has flourished in my family since we navigated that difficult summer 5 years ago. James and Melissa now visit Willow Creek at least once a month, not out of obligation but genuine interest. What began as Melissa's tentative exploration of historical preservation has blossomed into a passionate commitment that has transformed her professional life. Her consultancy, Heritage Forward, has become the region's premier resource for historical properties seeking to balance authentic preservation with contemporary relevance. She brings groups of clients to Willow Creek regularly, using our restoration journey as a case study in successful multi-generational stewardship. What Eleanor and Richard accomplished here goes beyond physical preservation, I overheard her telling a group of Historical Society directors last month. They created a model for how historical spaces can remain living, breathing environments rather than sterile museums, relevant to contemporary life while honoring their original character. Hearing my daughter-in-law speak with such conviction about principles that once seemed foreign to her still catches me by surprise. The transformation in her understanding didn't happen overnight. It evolved through countless conversations on the garden bench, through hours spent together in the archives room reviewing restoration photographs, through the gradual recognition that true legacy consists of values and knowledge passed down, not just objects or appearances. James, too, has found new purpose in preservation work. His financial expertise now supports a foundation dedicated to helping historical properties develop sustainable economic models. Most preservation efforts fail not because people don't care about history, he explained during a recent presentation, but because they lack viable financial structures to support ongoing maintenance and operation. The methodical approach to problem-solving he inherited from his father has found perfect application in creating endowment structures for properties that might otherwise fall into neglect. Perhaps most touching is how our grandchildren have embraced this legacy. Catherine's daughters, now in their 20s, have both pursued careers connected to preservation. Emily as a textile conservator working with historical clothing collections, and Sophie as an architectural historian documenting endangered historical structures. James's children, though still in their teens, spend summers volunteering at Willow Creek, learning traditional maintenance skills and helping with archival projects. The silver collection that became the catalyst for this transformation continues to serve its dual purpose, professionally preserved at the museum while remaining connected to family celebrations. 3 times each year, selected pieces return to Willow Creek for special gatherings. Christmas dinner, the summer garden party that has become our annual family reunion, and a special November commemoration of Richard's birthday. These occasions have taken on new meaning as the silver is accompanied by a museum conservator, who not only ensures proper handling, but shares insights about each piece's historical significance with younger family members. What might once have seemed like burdensome protocol has become an eagerly anticipated educational component of our gatherings, with even the youngest children developing impressive knowledge about hallmarks, patterns, and manufacturing techniques. Grandma, this is a Gorham Chantilly pattern serving spoon from 1895. My 8-year-old great-grandson informed me with solemn precision at last Christmas's dinner. You can tell because of the specific way the flowers curve around the handle and the special mark under the silver standard. His proud recitation represented exactly what Richard and I had always hoped for. Not just preservation of physical objects, but transmission of the knowledge and appreciation that gives those objects meaning. The silver collection has become a tangible connection between generations, a physical embodiment of heritage that young family members can literally hold in their hands while learning about those who came before them. The Richard Harrington Conservation endowment that James and Melissa established has grown beyond its original purpose of maintaining our family silver. It now supports a broader educational initiative that teaches traditional conservation skills to middle and high school students through summer workshops held at Willow Creek. These programs, developed in partnership with the Historical Society and local schools, provide hands-on experience with various preservation techniques: silver conservation, wood restoration, archival documentation, and historical research methods. "We're not just teaching them about old stuff," Melissa explained to a local reporter covering the program. "We're showing them that the past isn't separate from the present, that history is a continuous thread we're all part of. These skills connect them to something larger than themselves." Each summer, 20 students spend 2 weeks learning from professional conservators and working on actual preservation projects around the estate. They leave with practical skills, a deeper appreciation for craftsmanship, and often a transformed perspective on the value of historical artifacts and environments. "Before this program, I thought old houses were just, old," one teenage participant told me last summer as he carefully restored a section of gingerbread trim on the front porch. "Now I see all the stories in the woodwork, who made it, how they made it, why they made it that way. It's like the house is talking to you once you know how to listen." That capacity to listen to what historical objects and spaces can tell us was exactly what Richard and I had tried to develop in our children throughout their lives. While Catherine had readily embraced this perspective, James had seemed more focused on the future than the past. The conflict over the silver collection and vow renewal, painful as it was in the moment, became the unexpected doorway through which he finally accessed that understanding. 3 years ago, James surprised me by undertaking a research project of his own, documenting the economic history of Willow Creek Estate from its original construction through our purchase and restoration. His meticulous analysis traced how the property had adapted to changing economic conditions over decades, surviving the transition from agricultural prosperity to industrial development to heritage tourism. "The remarkable thing," he told me as we reviewed his findings, "is how each generation found ways to make the estate economically viable without compromising its historical integrity. There were opportunities for more profitable use of the property at every stage, but successive owners chose preservation over maximization. That's not sentimental thinking. It's a different kind of value calculation that traditional financial models don't capture." His insight captured perfectly what Richard had tried to teach him years earlier. The true value often exists in dimensions beyond monetary measurement, and that the most significant returns on investment might be measured in continuity, beauty, and meaning rather than dollars. Last year brought a particularly meaningful milestone when Melissa was appointed to the State Historical Preservation Board, a position I had held 20 years earlier. At her induction ceremony, she surprised me by specifically crediting our conflict over the silver collection as the turning point in her understanding of heritage conservation. 5 years ago, I viewed historical objects and properties primarily as backdrops, impressive settings for contemporary life, but fundamentally separate from it, she acknowledged candidly to the gathered preservation community. "It took a carefully orchestrated education from my mother-in-law to help me understand that true heritage isn't a static display, but a living connection. That when we preserve historical spaces and objects, we're not just saving things, but safeguarding ways of understanding ourselves and our place in the continuous human story." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not just because they represented her personal growth, but because they echoed so perfectly what Richard had believed and taught throughout his life. Though he hadn't lived to witness this transformation, his vision for why preservation matters had finally taken root in unexpected soil. The most profound change, however, has been in how our extended family functions as a community. What was once a relatively conventional family structure with occasional gatherings around holidays has evolved into an intergenerational collaboration centered on shared purposes and values. Family members from 8 to 83 now participate in various aspects of maintaining Willow Creek and contributing to its educational mission. Catherine's husband, Robert, Initially the family member least interested in historical matters, now coordinates the practical aspects of the student's summer program, drawing on his experience as a retired school administrator. My great-grandchildren eagerly anticipate their roles as junior docents during the annual garden tour, proudly sharing facts about heritage plant varieties with visitors 3 or 4 times their age. Even distant relatives who once viewed Willow Creek as merely Eleanor and Richard's project now participate in the annual volunteer weekend when family members gather to tackle specific preservation and maintenance tasks. This transformation hasn't been without challenges. There are still occasional tensions when contemporary needs conflict with historical authenticity, when younger generations propose changes that seem to contradict preservation principles. But the framework we've developed for addressing these conflicts focuses on education and understanding rather than authority or control. Every generation has adapted this house to its needs while respecting its essential character, I remind family members when such conflicts arise. Our job isn't to freeze Willow Creek in time, but to ensure that changes are made with knowledge and intention rather than convenience or fashion. This approach has allowed Willow Creek to evolve thoughtfully. The kitchen now includes carefully integrated modern appliances hidden behind period-appropriate cabinetry. Solar panels provide sustainable energy from a position invisible from the ground. Accessibility modifications accommodate aging family members while preserving historical features. Each change is preceded by research, documentation, and family discussion about how to balance contemporary needs with historical integrity. As I look back on that difficult summer 5 years ago, what strikes me most is how unnecessary the conflict could have seemed at the time. Had I simply acquiesced to James and Melissa's original plans, allowed them to use the silver collection without understanding its significance, accepted being excluded from parts of the celebration in my own home, we might have avoided immediate tension. Family gatherings would have continued with surface harmony, masking deeper misunderstandings. Instead, by taking a stand for both the physical preservation of family treasures and the respect due to their caretaker, I created an opportunity for genuine education and transformation. The short-term discomfort led to long-term understanding that has enriched all our lives far more profoundly than polite accommodation ever could have. This past Christmas, as 4 generations gathered around the dining table at Willow Creek, the professionally conserved silver collection gleaming in the candlelight, as it had for more than a century of family celebrations, I found myself seated between James and Melissa. As we prepared to share our traditional moment of gratitude, before the meal, James raised his glass, a crystal water goblet that had belonged to his great-grandmother. "To Mom," he said, his voice carrying unusual emotion, "who taught us that the most valuable inheritance isn't silver or property, but understanding, the knowledge of where we come from and why it matters. Thank you for not settling for less than that, even when it would have been easier." Melissa reached for my hand, adding her own toast, and to second chances, for seeing what we failed to see, for learning what we didn't know we needed to learn, and for the wisdom to guide us toward that understanding with patience and love. As glasses clinked around the table, I felt Richard's presence as strongly as I had at any moment since his passing. This was exactly the legacy we had hoped to create, not just preserved objects or a beautiful old house, but a family that understood why these things mattered. Who would carry that understanding forward into a future we wouldn't see? The silver collection that had once been the focus of conflict now seemed almost incidental, a beautiful but ultimately secondary manifestation of the more important inheritance of values, knowledge, and perspective. The museum displays, the conservation endowment, the educational programs, all were valuable, but they merely provided structure for the true legacy, the capacity to value continuity while embracing change, to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, to see beyond surface appearances to the deeper meanings beneath. As I look toward the future, Knowing that at 78 I have more years behind me than ahead, I feel a profound peace about what Richard and I have accomplished. Willow Creek will continue, not as a static shrine to the past, but as a living environment where history breathes alongside contemporary life. The silver collection will remain properly preserved, while continuing to serve its purpose in family celebrations. Most importantly, the understanding that gives these material things meaning will persist through the generations who have now embraced their role as stewards rather than merely inheritors. The conflict that began with exclusion. My son's wife told me I couldn't attend their vow renewal, led ultimately to a deeper inclusion than I could have imagined. Not just my physical presence at a celebration, but the genuine incorporation of the values and perspectives I represented into the family's ongoing life, and the silver collection that they wanted. It found its perfect balance, professionally, preserved yet still an active part of family traditions, its dual existence at the museum and at family gatherings, a physical representation of how we've learned to balance innovation with tradition, personal preferences with collective heritage, progress with preservation. In the end, what I renewed wasn't just silver but understanding, the recognition that true legacy consists not in possessing beautiful objects, but in appreciating why they matter and ensuring that appreciation continues. That renewal, unlike the polishing of silver that must be regularly repeated, has become self-sustaining, passed from one generation to the next, not as obligation, but as valued knowledge. As I watch my grandchildren and great-grandchildren move confidently between historical appreciation and contemporary innovation, I know that Richard would be proud of what his vision has become, not a burden of maintenance passed to reluctant inheritors, but a living tradition embraced by engaged participants who understand that in preserving the past, they're not just looking backward, but building connection to all that has made us, who we are, and all we might yet become. If you're facing a family conflict that seems insurmountable, remember that sometimes the most loving response isn't accommodation, but education. Not giving in to maintain surface harmony, but standing firm for deeper values in ways that create opportunities for genuine understanding. The temporary discomfort of confrontation may open doorways to transformation that would otherwise remain forever closed. And if you're the keeper of family heritage, whether silver, property, photographs, or stories, consider that your most important task isn't just preserving physical objects, but transmitting the knowledge and values that give those objects meaning. Material things may tarnish, break, or disappear, but understanding, once established, can renew itself in each generation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Remember, every family conflict contains the possibility of deeper connection if we approach it not as a battle to be won, but as an opportunity for mutual growth and understanding.